5 seats. One of them, set just inside the swing of the kitchen doors, had my name on it. They led me there with the same polite choreography reserved for other people's inconveniences. A crisp navy dress, the wedding planner's practice smile, a silver place card clamped in a holder shaped like a clamshell. The ballroom gleamed, chandeliers like frost, marble that seemed to hum beneath my heels, the long tables dressed as if they belonged to a magazine. Servers moved in a practiced, cheerful blur. Somewhere near the back, the orchestra tuned. A few notes that smelled of lemon and winter clung to the air. "Right this way, Mrs. Coleman," the planner said. Her voice was small and efficient, and wrapped in a kindness that had teeth. I saw the place card before I saw the swing doors, Martha Coleman, inked in a script so exact it made my own handwriting feel like something handwritten in another century. I had to bend to read it. For a second I felt the old habit. Lift the paper to better the world. The kitchen opened with a polite clatter. Warmth and steam and the smell of butter and stalks pressed against the space like an apologetic neighbor. He stood with Veronica beneath a canopy of orchids, and my son did not look at me. He clapped with the others. He smiled at his new wife with a kind of light I had not seen in him since he was small enough to hide in my lap during power outages. His face open, trustable, and full of something I had helped build. My chest tightened, and I told myself it was only the sudden heat. They had set me as if to say, "You are welcome so long as you are useful." Beyond that, the kitchen swing acted like a border. You could see me. You could not include me. The first dance finished. Glasses rose. Later, when people would say the evening was flawless, they would mean the linens and the chorded music and the way Veronica's veil had swallowed the light around her shoulders. They would not mean how I sat there with my coat folded on my lap, as though my body were something to be kept tidy until someone needed it back. I thought of the swing door closing as if it were a literal hinge on my life, as if a world had decided the place where I belonged was at the margins of spectacle. Here we are, by the kitchen. It was the thought that started everything else. It arrived like a small boat riding a big wave, clear and impossible to ignore. If you want more true human stories like this, subscribe. They clapped for speeches, and for the cousin who'd flown in from Seattle, and for the partner who had written a poem. Between the banter and the toasts I catalogued, as mothers do, every measured shame and every small mercy that had carved William into the man at whose wedding I now sat. I catalogued sacrifices because that is the work of the heart, when it wants to prove something, to itself perhaps more than to anyone else. It had been less dramatic than a sacrifice, and more brutal in its persistence. There were mortgages and nights pinched for tuition, rinsed dinners of rice and canned tomatoes for months when a check had bounced for reasons that had nothing to do with us. There were my 2 jobs, the university lectures where I pretended my hands were not already tired, and the evening proofreading I'd take home in a paper-strewn tote. There were the small patient lies you tell children to smooth the jagged edges of instability. "We'll be fine," I told him when the roof leaked, the words like hot bread in my mouth. You give, and you don't stop because the love is simpler than the arithmetic. When William was 5, he fell asleep with a book open on his chest. Thoreau, of all things, because I'd read to him from the dog-eared Walden while we ate buttered toast, and the radio hummed in the next room. He spat out choices like a bibliophile and a boy. At 12, he mowed lawns until his palms were raw, so he could buy a pair of sneakers the neighborhood boys said would make him someone. At 18, he left with a duffel, a scholarship letter tucked into his sock. Those years, the ones we gave up small pleasures for, stretched like a map across my memory. I had remortgaged the house once for his tuition. I had taken out an equity loan to cover an exam fee that turned out to be an exam he aced anyway. I had signed papers because my husband Charles was gone, and the world seemed to insist on proof that a woman alone could be trusted to hold both reason and risk under one roof. I did not tell him everything. Mothers rarely do. But I kept a ledger in my head of the quiet things. The nights I slept on the couch so he could have the bed, when stress made him seek the center of our house, the afternoons I spent driving him to interviews, the letters I mailed when his bank account read zero and his dignity trembled. $156,000, the ledger whispered once in the dark. Tuition, loans, and assisted residency, the little things that add up. The number sat like a coat over my shoulders, heavy but worn in. I did not flaunt it, but I knew the weight. I had expected his gratitude to be modest, private. A phone call, a folded note, the occasional slow Sunday afternoon when he would come over and read with me by the porch light. Instead, there was Veronica, and the world she carried like perfume. Veronica had been polished the way a silver tray is. There's a long internal effort behind that gleam. She arrived in William's life as if she were the proper punctuation his achievements had been waiting for. She had been raised in a house with columns, where their family portrait said status with the certainty of heirloom silver. The Bennets measured themselves by quiet things: a comfortable silence across the dining table, an absence of debt in spoken numbers, an ability to make time look like taste. They were not cruel. They simply had a shorthand for worth that made mine look like a footnote. On the terrace after the third course, when sparklers were almost ready, and someone obstinately tried to start the band without the conductor, my phone buzzed. William. It was text. A photograph flickered first, a receipt, an itinerary, a message trailing like an upended suitcase. The text was not written with irritation, so much as with bare expectation. Final honeymoon payment, it read. Please wire the $30,000 tonight. Love you. I sat very still. The ocean on the horizon was a dark, uninterrupted line. Laughter built behind me like a tide. $30,000. Part of the $93,000 they had put together for the wedding and honeymoon. Details my son had assumed I would help fill in, because that was how his life had been arranged. My labor and my savings threaded into his rise. For a beat, I felt nothing but the mechanical operations of a ledger in my mind. Transfer. Confirm. I could have, that instant, sent the money through the phone. I had the means. It would have taken the smallest, most private motion. But the impulse to smooth over, to preserve appearances, was starting to look like a larger theft, the theft of my son's own truth. I thought of the way he had not looked at me since our names, our shared past, had become inconvenient scenery. I thought of the kitchen door swinging shut like a verdict, of the place card that implied I belonged only while I produced. And then I thought of all the ways my giving had become a script he performed for other people. Martha Coleman could have been the woman who kept giving until she was empty. For years that had been part of her training. But something in me that morning, maybe the residue of a long life with books and with a husband who had loved language enough to leave a compass on my bedside table, decided there were boundaries to be honored. There are gifts that make sons into men and gifts that make them into actors. I was tired of writing the lines for a performance that would never let him be himself. The decision came in the small hours between courses and toasts. I did not make a dramatic scene. Drama was not my temperament. I placed the phone on the table, put my napkin in my lap, and held the silence like a small, shining object. Later, someone would call it a refusal. William called it selfish. Veronica called it cruel. But what I did that night was less about money than about identity. I had chosen to stop underwriting a version of my son I no longer recognized. I chose to defend a different kind of inheritance, one not measured in dollars, but in the courage to be whole. After the band finished their third song and the lights dimmed low enough to render faces into soft gestures, Veronica found a way to the service door. She walked with that precise balance of confidence and training, the posture of a woman who had been taught how to carry herself in rooms that were paid homage to. She did not look at me as she stepped through the swing. She looked at me as if she were checking whether I was about to be useful. "Mrs. Coleman," she said brightly, the color of her voice the same as her bouquet. "We should talk." We did not speak in the ballroom. The hotel corridor outside the French doors was small and smelled like lemon oil and tired perfume. It had, mercifully, the excellent acoustics of a space where people cannot hide much. "You refused the payment," she began, as if I had done something clumsy and rude, like refusing to pass the salt. "Yes," I said. "Present tense, the way you answer when you are both anchoring yourself and testing the water." I did. There was an accusation wrapped in her syllables, which she did not try to mask. "Do you know what this is for? The whole trip. This is our honeymoon. It's the first thing we have planned as a married couple, and you—" Her voice tightened, then smoothed. "You are making this very difficult." I thought of the ledger that day, of the remortgage, and of the nights I'd eaten soup and bread to make sure his fund was not empty. I thought of earlier conversations in which William had assured me that the Bennets would handle their part. I thought of a pride so eager to believe new goodness that it would overlook small, steady erasures. "William has always done well," I said. "You know that. He worked himself up. He earned things in ways you admire." She had the answer ready. "But families help. That's what families do, Martha. We step in." "Yes," I said again. "They do. And sometimes families demand things in return that are not proper." She laughed, a successful, precise sound. "That's a bit dramatic." "Then make it less dramatic for yourself," I said. "Ask him to look at what he's defending. Ask him to look at you." The words surprised me with their tenderness. They were not meant as a barb. I wanted him to be seen without the performance. Veronica's face shifted in ways that made me think of porcelain. "He loves me," she said. Her voice had an edge then, a small feral note. "He's doing what he wants." "Loving someone doesn't mean building a life out of borrowed pieces," I said. "It's easy to tie yourself to people who have already been given everything. It is harder to build with a partner who knows how to stand when the applause fades." She looked at me then, and I saw, for a flicker of a breath, something off the script. Maybe it was weariness. Maybe it was the brief, private admission that marriage is not only champagne and table settings, but also cheap nights, and the steady rhythm of a dishwasher, and of who actually knows how to fix a leaking sink. "You're just bitter," she said finally. "You could have helped. You chose not to. I thought of the compass my husband had given me the first year we married, a small silver thing with a dimple on its case. Charles had been a man who loved navigation metaphors. He liked the idea that you could correct your course if the needle was true. I kept it on my bedside table. I thought about turning it out and seeing which way the needle leaned. "I'm not bitter," I said. "I'm tired of financing a story that isn't honest. I want William to be with someone who knows him for himself, not for what my labor made possible." She had the look of someone who had never heard such a sentence in the same register as tenderness. "You sound like a villain," she said. "Maybe a necessary one," I answered, which was the most dangerous thing to say to a young woman whose life was mostly public performance and private insecurity. There are knives in that territory, truths that sting, wagons of privilege that never notice where they roll. Veronica threw a small, swift smile at me as if to say, "See how uncivil she is?" And then she left the corridor, sliding back into the ballroom where the guests lifted their glasses to a toast I was not allowed to make. I could have let the night end there, and the money remain unpaid, and perhaps the story would have ended with a bitter dinner and a quiet friction that settled into a new normal. But the next morning, over a weak hotel coffee, the text thread buzzed again, and this time it was sharper. "Why would you do that?" William wrote, the message coursing with confusion and something I suspected might be shame. "This is public. You humiliated me." Humiliated. Words have seasons. That one felt like frost. We spoke on the phone for a long time. He sounded like a man who had read the wrong review of his life. He accused me of selfishness. He accused me of not understanding the stakes of his marriage. He accused, without saying the word, vanity, as if I were the one who wanted to be seen. I told him I understood the stakes very well. I told him that for all the things he'd earned, he had always been quick to grant others the assumption of stability that I had created, that the money was never the only thing, that the largest theft, in my view, was not of cash, but of the opportunity to be honest about who he was and what he wanted, that perhaps the Bennets were asking him to cut a piece of himself off so that he would fit a table that had been set years before he was born. There was silence on the line long enough for me to hear the elevator in the hotel, the brush of distant voices. "You don't get to decide for me," he said finally, and an honest hurt peeped through. "Maybe," I said, "but I get to decide for myself." It was a small, private revolution. I would not promise him a pressure-free life. I would not ask him to throw away his marriage. I would, however, refuse to help prop a show that asked him to be someone else. When I hung up the phone, my hands shook. I did not think of drama. I thought of the porch swing back home in Savannah and the music from the radio on afternoons when the sea fog had slid in and made everything feel soundless and important. I thought of Charles and the compass. In some quiet, unspoken way, I felt him there, as if the needle were steadying under his thumb. The refusal meant something practical as well as symbolic. $30,000 would have been a smooth, invisible bridge. Without it, there would be consequences. There would be strain and awkwardness, perhaps an unraveling in ways I could not predict. I was not naive. I had not spent enough years to believe that all proper acts come without consequence. I had, however, earned the right to choose which consequences I would bear. That afternoon, Veronica sent a note through her mother, Elizabeth Bennet, thinly apologetic, offering to discuss alternatives. The note was suffocatingly polite. Elizabeth, she wrote, hoped we could still forge a cordial relationship. I wondered what warm pleasantries looked like inside the Bennet household. Silver polished to the sheen of a mirror, gardens trimmed to perfect geometries, a moral life measured in unblemished linens. Later, on the drive back across the bridge to Savannah, the city slipping into the rear view like a postcard in motion, I thought of the Coleman collection. It sat in a lockbox at the museum downtown, a modest but fierce array of first editions and letters, Walden with a margin note in a faded hand, a signed copy of a poet only a few people still remembered. It was not wealth to be spent in gossip column measures. It was better than money. It was a living thing, a proof of a family that loved books enough to keep them. I had promised Charles once, years ago, that the collection would stay intact. "Some things you don't sell," he had said, hands smelling of cedar and solder, setting down a compass and a cup of coffee. "Some things you steward. Stewardship is not the same as ownership. Stewardship is the work of holding." At home, the house smelled like yeast bread, and the codger of the neighbor's dog barking at someone who had no business there. I set the keys down and sat at my kitchen table, the same one where William had sat as a boy and smeared jelly beside his homework. The table still retained a few of the faded rings of long-ago cups. Its grain had a geography of family life, scratches that echoed where a child once dragged a toy car. I ran my fingers along the rim and thought of the way we had always eaten together, the dishes always needing clearing. The kitchen is where you see the real state of things. No silver is ever necessary there. My phone buzzed. Another message from William, sharper. He wanted to know if this was a final refusal or a temporary stare-down. He wanted to know if I had considered the consequences for him, how the families involved would read it, gossip about it. He wanted to know if I loved him. I thought about the word love. Love, in the way I had learned it, was not an invitation to smooth over another's cheats. Love sometimes required the difficult work of say no. I typed, then deleted, then typed again. "I love you," I wrote finally. "I also love the man you might be if you stripped away what you think you must carry for others. Tonight I cannot, will not, send the money." There was no immediate reply. Then a single sentence. "We'll talk when you get here." He did not come that week. Weeks are a funny measuring tool. They are the way grief and amendment both often register their first moods. In the neighborhood, the oaks were finishing their slow, patient unfurling. I kept busy as a kind of therapy, grading essays, arranging the small exhibition files at the museum, calling the scholarship board about a lecture I had been asked to give. Routine is a kind of remedy. It stitches small holes. I heard, through the linen of rumor and polite inquiry, that the Bennets were upset. Veronica did not say the words out loud, but she radiated them in the way she avoided my glance when we passed at a function. The place card remained circled in my memory. People asked how I was. People asked if William was well. The questions were careful. My answers were careful too. Then, one morning, the kind of morning where the marsh mist made the world look like an old watercolor, there was a knock on my front porch. It was Vanessa who came first, small and earnest, a teacher's face that held pity and bravery in equal measure. Vanessa had always had a way of speaking that made you feel seen, even when she disagreed with you. She left a letter, folded in a manner that made me remember the first time I had sewed a hem and how precise the crease had been. The note read, in Vanessa's careful pencil, "I am so sorry for how things have been. I love my sister and I want the best for William. I think you might too. Could we talk?" That night I put the note beside the compass, as if the two objects might find some agreement. There was, I realized, a possibility of human kindness even in the Bennets. They had in their chest the same complicated anatomy as anyone. Fear of losing face, yes, but also the possibility of understanding if the walls were cracked enough. I found a photograph of Charles that evening. He was sitting on the back step with his shoes off, newspaper folded beside him like a small domestic altar. He looked younger there, not yet bent by illness and patience. I reached for the small silver compass and felt the cold metal steady under my fingers, as if his hand were still guiding the needle. If I had been the sort to lay down my life for William with the drama the public expected of a story like ours, perhaps I would have wired the money at once and allowed the show to continue. But the life I had made had been tempered by a different kind of training. Books, labor, slow accrual of small dignities. I had taught my son the difference between being admired and being anchored. The refusal was a test, yes, but also an invitation to his real life. There are costs to love. There are also costs to enabling. Those two ledgers do not balance easily. The next day, a car paused at my curb. It was not Veronica's. It was an older sedan, the kind whose lines belonged to another decade. A man stepped out and tipped his hat. Robert Bennet. He had a face that kept its measure, like a ledger that had been balanced by one who did not much need to brag. There was a ring of kindness in his posture that confused me instantly. His handshake was firm. His eyes were not the eyes of someone who blamed easily. "Mrs. Coleman," he said, and the voice was something like apology in 3 parts. "May I come in for a moment?" I thought of all the ways the Bennets could engineer this as an inquisition. I thought of how polite men sometimes spoke in the tones of court. I made room at the table. We sat amid the familiar clutter, an absent-minded stack of essays, the compass, the photograph of Charles. "You know what I have," he said without preamble. "Your collection." It was not an accusation. It was a fact, offered like a place card set between two people. He slid something across the table, an envelope, the kind paper that has always reminded me of legal things. My hands felt colder than the paper. He did not speak loudly. He did not need to. The envelope had the word prenup written in a precise hand. He had an air about him that suggested he had not come simply to demand. He had come to show me a document, a map of what had been arranged without my knowledge and a choice laid open like a knife. "I think you should see this," he said quietly, and in the way he said it, I felt the first real shift. He placed the envelope on the table as if it were a thing that belonged there by right, like a salt cellar or a stray newspaper. The afternoon had thinned to a daub of light through the blinds. The house smelled of baking yeast and the river salt that clung to Savannah afternoons. Robert Bennet did not fidget. He folded his hands and let the paper sit between us. "I wanted you to have it," he said. Martha did not reach for it at once. The room hummed with a sort of polite distance, a man from a different map sitting in her kitchen, the compass of her marriage not likely to show him where north lay. She tapped the lid of the small silver compass on the table. The metal still held Charles's thumbprint in a faint dent. It steadied her more than a chair could have. "What is it?" she asked. "A copy of the agreement Veronica and William signed," Robert said. His voice was softer than at the wedding. "Nothing you weren't entitled to see, and something I thought, perhaps wrongly, might be of use to you." There was an art to the way he placed the thing on the wood. It was not offered as a weapon. He was not there to lecture. He was there, improbably, to make information available. Martha slid the envelope open with the careful, practiced motion of someone who had unwrapped parcels for a living, textbooks, proofs, a child's birthday gift. The prenup lay inside, folded with a clinical neatness. Legalese spread in columns like an unfamiliar language. She read through the first pages, her fingers smoothing the paper as if feeling a truth emerge at the tips. "He wanted to protect what he thought his daughter needed," Robert said after a moment. "I won't pretend it wasn't motivated by that. But I also want you to know I did not want him to be bought by a family, an image, or an idea of what success looks like." He paused. "When I heard where you sat last night, I thought, perhaps I ought to speak plainly." The document did not read like a confession, but to Martha it read like a map of assumptions. It spelled out expectations of domicile, of public role, of finances, and it held clauses that were less benign than they appeared. There were stipulations about residency and the stewardship of certain gifts, language that leaned toward shaping the course of a life rather than merely protecting assets. To a citizen of the Bennets' world, such papers were a hedge. To someone raised by thrift and lectures, they could become a boundary that decided who a man could be. "I didn't know," Martha said. Her tone was even, not a glare, not a claim. "I didn't know you had that much say." "I didn't intend to be the sort of man who prescribes another's life," he admitted. "That was my failure in this. I have been blind to the ways my decisions could become chains. I thought I was preserving something, stability, reputation. Perhaps I was preserving my own comforts." He folded his hands again and for the first time let a crack of private admission show. It was small, but it mattered more than his tailored suit. "There's more," he said. "I spoke to the foundation. We have the means to do something that won't take the Colemans out into private rooms to be admired by a handful, nor will it turn your collection into merchandise. We could underwrite an exhibition with the museum, select items, curated responsibly, the proceeds earmarked for scholarships and community programs. That way, the collection, what you and your husband protected, serves what you both cared about: access, learning, stewardship." Martha looked at him as if he'd set down a jar with two half-full lids. It could be a trap. It could be a genuine olive branch. The Bennets offered a bridge, and she had spent a lifetime walking roads of both kinds. "You could have sent a check," she said dryly, "because there are occasions when gallows humor is a way into truth." Robert smiled, a small softening. "A check wouldn't have been right. You're not someone who wants to be bought off. What I'm offering is a partnership and a guarantee that nothing will be sold. I want the public to see what you've kept intact. And if there is damage done, if William's choices have been influenced by the architecture of expectation, then perhaps the Bennets bear a share of responsibility." Martha let the sentence sit. It was not an apology that erased the place card or the evening. It was, dangerously, an invitation to do something that would translate pain into public good. A lifetime of restraint taught her to be careful with offers that sounded like salvation. "You're asking me to let you into the stewardship," she said. "Not to sell it, not to be a headline, to curate, to teach." "That is precisely it," he said. "We will underwrite the costs of conservation, the display, educational materials. The scholarships will be funded out of an independent trust. My daughter will not control it. You will." The invitation was generous in a way that left room for pride. Martha pressed the compass into her palm, feeling the dent of Charles's thumb again. To steward meant to hold, and to refuse profits facile solutions. Charles had taught her that. The small metal circles seemed to spin with a purpose. "If I say yes, I sign a responsibility," she said. "I don't sign my son's conscience over to anyone." "No," Robert said. "You don't." They spoke for an hour about logistics and curation and the language of exhibits. For the first time since the place card had been set, the day opened to more than reproach. There was a pragmatic alliance forming, an odd interstitial thing that bore the shape of apology without the show of contrition. Martha nodded at times, skeptical, protective, but not unready to forge a way if it kept the collection's integrity intact and channeled its influence toward people like William once had been, the bright, the indebted, the hungry for a chance. When he left, he did so with the same measured acknowledgement of distance he'd arrived with. He did not promise miracles. He promised a meeting with the curator, a letter of intent from the foundation, a clean, legal structure that would protect the collection and the scholarships from family politics. He left the envelope on the table, copies of the prenup, a note signed in his serif script, an outline for a public exhibition. Weeks folded into each other with the discreet rhythm of people who try to mend a rupture without turning it into spectacle. Vanessa visited more than once. She brought soup and an eagerness that was not performative. She spoke to Martha of Veronica, not in defense of her sister, but in the quiet way of someone who minced less and wanted more common ground. "You have a way of making people feel small," Vanessa said one afternoon, plopping into a chair as if it were hers. "My sister never knew how to. I don't know. She's learning, I think. She's not what you might think. She's not as polished as she seems." Martha looked at her. Vanessa's eyes were earnest the way teachers' eyes are, careful, curious, always inventorying the ways to help. "I think she admires the things she doesn't have," Vanessa added. "That's not a crime." "No," Martha said, "but admiration can be a kind of hunger that eats you if you don't know where to set the table." Vanessa laughed, a short, surprised sound. "That's a phrase for the book." Vanessa became a bridge in small ways. She began bringing Veronica to community events that were not gala affairs, a reading at the hospital, a volunteer day at the museum. Veronica floundered in the beginning. The role of someone who is seen without having to be perfect is not a simple one, but she tried. She helped dust cases. She smiled at kids. She came to a talk where Maria, the scholarship recipient, spoke about what the opportunity had meant to her. The simplicity of those days, far from the glare of a ballroom, did more to erode artifice than any laundry list of apologias. William's absence lengthened. He stayed with Marcus for a while, staying close enough to the hospital to keep his hands in the work he'd trained for, but far enough from the hospital corridors he had inhabited since his residency to be able to breathe. Marcus fed him and cooked for him with a blunt, practical affection. He listened without acting as priest or judge, just an ear and a steady shoulder for a man learning how to be without performance. Sometimes William read. He sat with Thoreau and Baldwin and the odd volumes of poetry Charles had once loved, things Martha had left on the bedside table for when William was younger. He visited the porch where the tide crept in and did not call. When he did call, his voice was thinner. When they spoke in person, there were pauses like landings. He accused at first. He accused his mother of cruelty. Then, The accusations burned themselves out into a different vocabulary. Questions. Why had she not told him how much she'd given? Did she resent him? Did she regret his life? Martha answered steady, plain. She did not shame. She admitted fear and fatigue. "I did not keep a ledger to make you feel small," she said once. "I kept one so that I could carry the burdens that make life possible. I did it because I thought that was love. I did it because I worried. But I also realized sometime between your residency and this, that being loved into a role is not the same as being loved into wholeness." William took time. Time is one of the few kinds of medicine that works when it is allowed. He did not ask Martha for the money again. He canceled the parts of the honeymoon paid for in his name and let the airline credits lapse and the hotel hold the reservation. The world did not care in the way his heart cared. The Bennets murmured. Veronica bristled. The social press took the story and filed it into its small drawers. But among the private things, late-night talks at Marcus's, gentle arguments with a friend who would not let him cry alone, something changed. He stopped doing the things he had done to be admired and began, haltingly, to do some things that looked like living. Veronica's parents watched. Elizabeth called Martha once, a careful, old-fashioned conversation where neither woman said exactly what either felt, but both said enough. "We made errors," Elizabeth said finally, in a voice that had more gravel than Martha expected. "We thought we were preserving our daughter's world, and perhaps we were also building walls. I'm sorry you felt diminished. That was never the intention." The language was awkward. It was also real. There was wisdom in Vanessa's willingness to sit with the discomfort rather than repair it with the kind of polished comforts her family favored. She spoke simple truths to her sister, about humility, about what being seen without a spotlight feels like. Veronica stumbled through it, flailing at times, but the posture of trying mattered. In the end, Veronica and William talked. They debated honor and shame and their different expectations. They both loved parts of the life the other represented. They both also recognized that love could not be a costume to be donned in public and doffed in private. The couple decided, quietly and with a kind of mutual exhaustion, to dissolve what they had just created rather than keep a life that required either of them to deny themselves. That dissolution took the form of an annulment, arranged with the same private care as their first plans had been public. There were hurt feelings, apologies that did not always meet their mark, and private grief that belonged to each of them. When the papers were settled, the bloom of ceremony was gone. There was no public prizing of the moment, no vindictive shout across the social lawn. There was time for everyone to be small and private and human. Robert Bennet kept his promise. The Bennets Foundation signed an agreement with the museum and with Martha that left the Coleman's collection intact under Martha's stewardship. The items to be displayed were chosen with restrained, scholar-like hands, letters bent by thumb, a first edition bound in cloth, a small volume of marginalia that had once been Charles's favorite. The exhibit's explanatory text did not turn secrets into gossip. It explained context, pointed to the value of modest collections, and invited schoolchildren to come in for readings on scholarship days. When the exhibit opened, there was a weather of press and a weather of people who had nothing to do with announcements. The gallery smelled of polished wood and the hush of a room that knew how to be careful. The curator made a brief speech about stewardship. Robert spoke too, and his voice held a shade of the contrition he had voiced in the kitchen. He talked about the responsibility to keep treasures in the service of a community rather than hoarded in private rooms. He did not make Martha into a footnote. He made her a partner on the stage. William came to the opening. He walked slowly, as if testing the floor for sound. The place felt different from a ballroom, because no one there sought to flatter him by display. People greeted him without the chatter that had once been the currency of his social life. Veronica stood a short distance away, not as an enemy, but as an acquaintance learning how to be kind in a new register. Maria was there. She had been one of the first recipients of the Coleman Scholarship, an earnest woman who had nearly been denied a residency for reasons that had little to do with merit and much to do with who could pay. She spoke at the opening in a voice that trembled and steadied at once. "I was 13, Maria said into the microphone, when my mother sold her jewelry to pay for an application fee. I had a scholarship offer, but not the money to take advantage of it. The Coleman Fund gave me the ability to finish school, to get my license, to be a kind of doctor that helps neighborhoods like mine. I am here because someone refused to let a collection be small. I am here because someone chose not to use money to hide people, but to help them climb." Martha listened. There were tears, the kind that are both grief and relief. She thought of the remortgage and the borrowed nights and the way a child's laughter used to hide the sound of a radiator banging in the dark. She had never wanted a plaque or a name in lights. She wanted the small, steady work of people being able to live better lives. William spoke too, though he did not take the podium with the clipped confidence of a man used to being lauded. He read a short piece he had written, careful, precise, unshowy, about learning to stand in the place his parents had worked to make for him, and how easy it had been to trade that place for something temporary that glittered. "I came here because the thing I longed for," he said, "was not a table set by strangers, but a life I could stay at when the guests had gone." The crowd listened. Veronica came forward afterward and offered a clean hand. They spoke with the kind of civility freed of heat. No sparks, only the ash of two lives that had touched. The exhibition's proceeds flowed into a fund administered by a board on which Martha sat. Robert continued to be involved, but not in a way that diminished her voice. The Bennets' financial help was a tool rather than a performance. The money fed internships, reading programs, and a scholarship that focused specifically on students from backgrounds like William's, people whose intelligence had been shaped by thrift as much as by talent. Maria earned a mentor, and later returned to mentor others, a small cycle being its own kind of miracle. Time is a tempering kiln. Martha and William did not suddenly fold the evening at Newport into easy memory, but the edges softened. He began to visit more, to bring small dinners, to drop off a plate of whatever Marcus had concocted. They did not speak only of weighty things. They talked about nonsense, too. Movies, the state of the tomatoes, an old joke Charles used to tell that nobody else could tell right. Martha kept the compass on the table as a sort of lodestar, a small iron circle that reminded them both that direction could be chosen and that sometimes you needed to steady your needle. There was an afternoon when William found, tucked into an old book Martha had once read from to him, a narrow letter in Charles's hand. She had intended to give it at the right time. The envelope had yellowed, the script on it a familiar, affectionate slant. When William opened it, he read aloud, voice small and catching, "My boy, if at any time you feel the world expects you to be less yourself, remember that a house, like a heart, is a thing you keep with care. Do not mortgage your courage for someone else's applause. Steer by the needle of what you love, not by the spotlight. Love, C." He folded the paper back and smiled, a small private fix. "Your husband was wise," he said. "He was a good man," Martha said, and for once the words were simple enough not to need embroidery. The mending of a relationship is never exactly tidy. There were awkward dinners and silences, and one or two conversations that made Martha wonder if she had done the right thing. But there were also dinners of fish and hush-puppies, and afternoons when William sat at the table where he had eaten jam as a boy, and no one took notice of his achievements. It was a kind of ordinariness that felt like recovery. If the Bennets had expected a showy public recantation from Martha, they were disappointed. What she offered instead were small, steady gestures. She allowed the museum to publish a modest catalogue with essays and an acknowledgement of the foundation, not as a trophy, but as a record. She hired a conservator with a fellowship, funded in part by the foundation, to teach local students archival methods. The language remained careful. The press found little to blare. Veronica changed in the quiet way of someone who is given time to redo a life. She joined a community literacy program, shelved her social obligations that were more hunger than joy, and found, beneath the veneer, an appetite for doing work with her hands and her heart. Vanessa continued to be the bridge, uncertain, loyal, practical. Marcus remained a steady friend to William, insisting on unwavering honesty without spectacle. At times he teased him for being sentimental. At others, he let him be silent and hold his grief without comment. There was a backyard celebration some years later, a small thing marked by a ring of folding chairs, a grill, and a homemade cake. It was not William's wedding. It was a kind of reaffirmation for a family that had learned humility. The community came, neighbors who had always been neighbors, the scholarship recipients who had become friends, staff from the museum who had dusted the same books. There was music that everyone knew the words to. There were candles in jars. They took photographs, loose, candid, not posed for a society page. Martha stood at her kitchen table and later at the folding table outside, her fingers grazing the worn wood. The place card incident at Newport felt like a different life, a costume her body no longer wore. Sometimes, in the evening, when the light lay low and the sounds of cups clinking echoed in the house, Martha would look at the place card she'd kept folded inside a drawer. She flushed it, not as an object of anger, but as a memory of how small cruelties can be when placed to produce shame. She had carried the humiliation and made it into a question. What is honor? The answer had gradually become clear to her. Honor had nothing to do with velvet and chandeliers. It lived in how the table was set when no one was watching. The scholarship grew slowly. Maria became a mentor, then a colleague in the clinic where she worked 2 neighborhoods over. She would bring her own children once to sit at Martha's table, chattering and sticky-fingered and earnest, and Martha would pass a slice of pie across the wood. The exhibit remained in the museum as a quiet testament to restraint, objects with labels that taught children that a family keeps things because some things are meant to instruct rather than to impress. William found work at a hospital that served a community rather than a headline. He was not invisible. He was a surgeon with the same careful hands he'd always had. But he learned to step away from the prizes he had once pursued and to find the pleasure of work that did not require a table setting in grand rooms. He took fewer calls from people who wanted his nominations for boards, and more calls from patients asking for advice at 2 a.m. He answered both. When, years later, he married again, it was in the kitchen with the table at the center. The ceremony was short, full of jokes, unvarnished speeches, a neighbor-made bouquet. The room smelled of bread and lemon. The place cards were handwritten on plain paper. No one sat anyone at the door of a service entrance. The wedding was a quiet kind of triumph, a life chosen for its practice rather than its demonstration. The twins came into the family, a pair of bright, noisy children who left thumbprints on the table and questioned with ferocity. They uprooted the neatness of guests' chairs with their thrum. Martha learned to love the small chaos anew. She kept the compass at the center of the table, sometimes to check its needle and sometimes simply because it made the table feel like a map. She told the children stories about harbors and about books and about their grandfather, who left a note in a small scrawl and a compass for guidance. They listened with the large, uncredentialed attention that children give to the things adults can no longer see. Vanessa taught the twins to sew. Maria brought the children books from the scholarship program and made them laugh with tales from clinic work. Veronica came now and then. She brought a casserole or an apology and stayed for coffee. She had not been made into a villain, nor into a heroine. She had been allowed to exist as a person who had to learn, who sometimes failed, and who sometimes found small ways to be better. On a late summer evening, Martha sat with William at the table and watched the twins chase a half-melted popsicle across the porch. He nudged her, and she turned to him. "You never sat at their wedding like you sat in Newport," he said, not accusing, but noting the difference with a soft, rueful humor. "No," she answered. "At Newport, they set a place for me by the kitchen, because they thought they were being kind. At their wedding, I sat at the table because it was where life happens. He reached across and took her hand. He had a way of being present now that did not require applause. It was, in its quiet way, all the accolades she had ever wanted. The museum exhibit continued to rotate pieces in and out, each time with a school group and a steward's talk. The scholarships, small at first, grew as public trust in the program built. The Bennets remained a discreet presence. Letters from Robert and Elizabeth came with the seasons, their tone gradually more familial and less transactional. One morning, near the end of a long spring, Martha found a letter from Robert tucked into the spine of a catalogue. It read simply, "For careful hands." He did not try to take credit. He had helped create a structure so that the collection did what it could. It educated, it opened doors, it held stories. That, in the end, was the closest thing to atonement one might hope for from those with the power to give. People still spoke of the Newport incident now and then, as people will speak of the moment when a life changed, in anecdotes, in coffee conversations, in the notes of students. It never became the scandal some had hoped it would be, nor the heroic stand others tried to make of it. It remained mostly the hinge on which a family learned its limits. Martha thought often about the place card, the swing of the kitchen doors, and the smallness of the moment that had become so loud. She did not regret the refusal. She regretted the cost it had imposed on her son's pride and on his marriage. But she also recognized that some costs are the tuition you pay for a truer life. If anyone had a moral to the story, she believed it was this: the table where you are needed is not always the one set by society. The loudest seats are often the least honest. The kitchen table, with its rings and scratches and crumbs, is where you find what lasts. It is by that table that meals are planned, apologies are learned, hands are held, and sometimes lives are gently re-steered. On evenings when the children were asleep, when the house settled into a small comforting creak, Martha would run her fingers across the grain of the kitchen table and remember the first night she sat in the ballroom by the swing doors. The hurt had been sharp then, keen as frost. Over time it dissolved into something else, a lesson, a remaking, a quiet transformation. The compass still lived on the table, its metal dulled by use and years. She would often place her thumb on its dent, as if greeting an old friend. "You did a good thing," William said once, in that honest, quiet way he had learned, and she believed him. The family gatherings went on. They weren't perfect. There were new frictions, new annoyances, a burnt pie crust, a forgotten birthday, a disagreement about whether the twins should sleep with a nightlight. But the tone was different. The calls home were not calls for money or lists of obligations. They were invitations to sit, to eat, to be seen without a program. If you have a story about a table that matters, about a place where you felt seen, or where someone taught you to be honest, share it below. Tell us what your kitchen table looked like, how it smelled, who sat there. If you'd like more stories like this, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one.